My sister-in-law called me a freeloader, completely unaware I had just sold my startup for $600 million. The sharp, high-pitched chime of Lauren's silver dessert spoon striking the rim of her Baccarat crystal wine glass cut through the low, ambient hum of our Christmas Eve dinner. She did not tap the glass just once to get our attention. She tapped it 3 times, slowly, deliberately, ensuring the resonant ring echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the $3 million dining room my brother Jamal claimed to own. I was seated at the far end of the sprawling mahogany table, positioned intentionally near the kitchen swing door, the designated spot for the family disappointment. Beside me sat my 4-year-old son, Leo, quietly tracing the outline of a reindeer on his linen napkin, blissfully unaware of the hostility radiating from the head of the table. The massive chandelier overhead cast a brilliant, unforgiving light across the room, illuminating the tense, expectant faces of my parents. My father, Harrison, a prominent church deacon who wore his morality like a tailored suit, paused with his fork hovering over his plate. My mother, Vivian, smoothed the front of her designer dress, her eyes already locked onto me with that familiar, icy gleam of maternal disapproval. Lauren remained standing at the head of the table next to Jamal, adjusting the drape of her expensive silk gown before locking her gaze on me. She wore a smile that was perfectly engineered to look like compassion, though the corners of her mouth twitched with the thrill of the impending cruelty. "Kendra," Lauren began, her voice dripping with a sickly, sweet, performative pity that made the air in the room feel instantly heavier. "Jamal and I were talking earlier today, and we are just genuinely so worried about the example you are setting for little Leo." The room went absolutely silent. I did not move. I did not blink. I kept my hands resting gently in my lap, feeling the soft texture of my pressed wool trousers. I had spent my entire life as the designated shock absorber for this family's collective ego, but the inclusion of my son's name in Lauren's mouth sent a cold, precise current of electricity straight down my spine. "It is truly heartbreaking," Lauren continued, her voice rising slightly to ensure the private chef lingering in the hallway could hear her, "to see a child growing up with a mother who has been so utterly stagnant. You have been jobless and lazy for 4 entire years. You sit at home, doing absolutely nothing, draining the meager life insurance money David left behind. It's irresponsible, Kendra. It's embarrassing to watch. It is time for you to finally grow up, stop playing around with those little computers in your basement, and find a real job." Before I tell you exactly what happened next, and how the entire hierarchy of my toxic family collapsed in a matter of minutes, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. It always amazes me to see how far these stories travel, and how many of you around the world have had to sit at a table with people who share your blood but absolutely despise your light. Have you ever been the one carrying the weight of your family's judgment while silently building an empire they couldn't even comprehend? Let me know. I read every single comment. As Lauren's words hung in the suffocating silence of the dining room, my mother, Vivian, leaned forward, her heavy gold earrings catching the chandelier's light. She didn't rush to my defense. She never did. Instead, she nodded in solemn agreement, her face a mask of profound disappointment. "Lauren is absolutely right, Kendra," Vivian said, her tone as cold and sharp as cracked ice. "After David passed away so suddenly in that horrible car accident 4 years ago, we tried to help you. Your father and I pulled strings. We arranged a perfectly safe, respectable bank teller position for you. But you were too arrogant. You thought you were too smart to stand behind a counter. Instead, you chose to isolate yourself. You locked yourself in that dark house, obsessing over data codes and algorithms while your husband wasn't even cold in his grave. You abandoned the real world to play victim." The cruelty of her words was not new, but the sheer audacity of delivering them on Christmas Eve, with my 4-year-old son sitting inches away from me, was a new low. For 4 years, they had viewed my grief as an inconvenience to their social standing. They saw my late nights building my cybersecurity architecture, not as ambition, but as a mental breakdown, They had no idea that while they were busy maintaining the facade of Atlanta high society, I was coding the encryption matrix that would eventually be acquired by the largest defense contractor in the Northern Hemisphere. I looked at my brother Jamal. He was leaning back in his custom leather dining chair, swirling an expensive scotch, watching me with a look of supreme satisfaction. He was the golden child, the male heir who could do no wrong. He was the CEO of a logistics company that, according to my private forensic accounting, was hemorrhaging money at an apocalyptic rate. Yet in this room, he was the king, and I was the peasant allowed at his table solely to serve as a contrast to his manufactured greatness. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice or slap the table or give them the reaction they were so desperately trying to provoke. I simply reached over, poured a small amount of sparkling water into my glass, took a slow, deliberate sip, and set the glass down with a soft, final click against the mahogany. I looked directly into Lauren's eyes. Her smug, victorious smile faltered for a fraction of a second as she met my gaze, expecting tears, expecting a breakdown, expecting a defense. "I actually sold my company last month," I said. My voice was completely even, devoid of any emotional fluctuation. It was the voice of a woman who no longer needed to survive them. I decided it was time to step back so I could stay at home and raise my son full time. Lauren stared at me for a long moment before bursting into a sharp, mocking laugh. It was a loud, theatrical sound that echoed awkwardly in the tense room. "That useless little hobby of yours? The basement project?" She sneered, shaking her head as if I had just told the most pathetic joke she had ever heard. "Please, Kendra, do not insult our intelligence. How much could you possibly sell that pile of digital garbage for? $10,000? $5? Did you even get enough to buy a used Honda?" I kept my eyes locked on hers. I didn't lean forward. I didn't raise my chin. I just sat perfectly still in the center of the quiet sovereignty I had built from the ashes of my husband's death. $600 million, I said quietly. The silence that slammed into the dining room was so absolute, so physically heavy it felt as though all the oxygen had been instantaneously vacuumed from the space. My mother's hand, which had been reaching for her wine glass, froze in midair. Her fingers hovered over the crystal stem, trembling slightly. My father's jaw literally slackened. Lauren's mocking smile vanished, replaced by a pale, slack-jawed expression of sheer, unadulterated shock. The color drained from her perfectly contoured face so rapidly she looked as though she might faint. For a full 10 seconds, the only sound in the $3 million mansion was the soft breathing of my son next to me. Then the illusion of their superiority shattered. Jamal slammed his scotch glass down onto the table with such violent force the thick glass cracked. He pushed his heavy mahogany chair back so hard it tipped over and crashed against the hardwood floor. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his tailored suit, his face contorted in an ugly, desperate rage. He stormed out of the dining room without a word, his heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway toward his private study. No one at the table spoke. Lauren was still staring at me, her eyes wide with a frantic, terrified disbelief, her mind visibly struggling to process the number I had just dropped into the center of her perfect life. 600 million. It wasn't a number they could patronize. It wasn't a number they could dismiss. It was a number that completely obliterated the power dynamic of our entire bloodline. A minute later, Jamal stormed back into the dining room. His face was flushed dark red with fury, a vein pulsing dangerously at his temple. In his right hand, he clutched a thick, red-stamped manila folder. He marched straight to my end of the table and slammed the folder down directly onto my dinner plate, the heavy thud rattling the silverware. "You are a pathetic liar, Kendra!" Jamal roared, spit flying from his lips as his voice cracked with frantic aggression. "You're making up fantasy numbers to save face because my wife just humiliated you with the truth. Look at this folder. Look at it." He jabbed a trembling finger at the thick stack of papers. "This is the deed to this house. $3 million of prime Atlanta real estate. This is actual wealth. This is reality. I run a logistics company with 50 employees. I am the provider of this family. You are a pathetic, delusional widow who sits in a basement. Take your bastard kid, grab your coats, and get out of my house immediately. You are done here." He stood over me, panting, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me, to shrink me back down into the submissive little sister he had bullied his entire life. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I hadn't been that girl since the night I buried my husband. I didn't flinch. I didn't pull back. I slowly reached out, my manicured fingers brushing against the rough edge of the manila folder. I opened it. The official county deed was right there on top, exactly where he had left it to stroke his own ego. I calmly lifted the heavy, embossed paper, holding it up slightly to catch the light of the chandelier. "You really should read your own financial documents before you use them to threaten people, Jamal," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried clearly to every corner of the frozen room. I slowly pointed my index finger to the second paragraph of the deed, right under the property description. "Look closely at the name of the primary lien holder holding the mortgage on this beautiful home. Right there." Jamal narrowed his eyes, his chest puffing out as he scoffed loudly, a desperate attempt to maintain his crumbling authority. "Vanguard Holdings, LLC," he read, his tone dripping with condescension. "It's the private investment firm that bought out my mortgage debt 2 years ago when I refinanced. So what? I pay them. They work for me." I leaned back in my chair, allowing a slow, chilling smile to touch my lips for the first time all evening. It wasn't a smile of joy. It was the smile of an executioner who had just dropped the blade. "Vanguard Holdings is not a faceless corporate entity, Jamal," I said, my voice smooth and lethal. "It is a private subsidiary shell company established by my wealth management team in Delaware. I am the sole proprietor. I am Vanguard Holdings." Jamal froze. The aggressive posture instantly dissolved, his shoulders dropping as the blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified child. "According to the delinquency reports I received from my portfolio managers last Tuesday," I continued, never breaking eye contact with him, "you are currently 90 days past due on your mortgage payments. You don't own this house, Jamal. You are my tenant. And if I make one phone call at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, my legal team will initiate full foreclosure proceedings before the new year even begins." The silence that followed my revelation was not the peaceful quiet of a winter evening. It was the suffocating, heavy stillness of a collapsing structure, moments before the dust billows into the air. Jamal stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking, his chest completely frozen as the air trapped in his lungs refused to exhale. The arrogant, broad-shouldered CEO who had just commanded me to take my bastard child and leave was entirely gone, replaced by a hollow, terrified shell of a man who suddenly realized he was standing on a trap door I had meticulously built beneath his feet. Lauren snatched the Vanguard Holdings deed from his trembling fingers, her perfectly manicured acrylic nails scraping against the thick paper. She frantically scanned the document, her eyes darting back and forth across the legal jargon, her lips moving silently as she desperately searched for a loophole, a typo, anything that would prove I was bluffing. But the ink was black, the county seal was red, and the reality was absolute. "Jamal," Lauren whispered, her voice a fragile, broken reed. "Jamal, is this true? Did you refinance? Did you miss the payments?" Jamal didn't answer her. He couldn't. He slowly sank back into his overturned chair, which he had haphazardly righted, his hands gripping his knees so tightly his knuckles turned a bloodless white. The facade of his immense wealth, the $3 million mansion, the luxury cars in the driveway, the private chef in the kitchen. It was all a fragile house of cards financed by debt, and I held the only match. Seeing her golden child completely neutralized, my mother's shock violently mutated into a toxic, desperate, defensive rage. Vivian slammed her open palms flat against the mahogany table. The sudden violent impact sent a shockwave through the wood, knocking over her crystal goblet. Thick, dark red Cabernet Sauvignon spilled across the pristine white lace tablecloth, spreading rapidly like a fresh, bleeding wound. She didn't even glance at the stain. Her eyes, burning with a ferocious, irrational hatred, were locked entirely on me. "How dare you!" Vivian hissed through clenched teeth, the mask of the elegant society matriarch slipping completely to reveal the venomous favoritism beneath. "How dare you quietly buy up your own brother's debt just to humiliate him on Christmas Eve? You vindictive, jealous little girl. Jamal is the only male heir to this family. He carries the family name. He's building a legacy, and he deserves to be protected and respected. You have $600 million now. Fine. You don't need this house. You have more money than you could ever spend in a lifetime. You are going to sign the deed to this property over to Jamal tonight. Free and clear, you will wipe away his debt, and you will apologize to him and your sister-in-law for this disgusting display of arrogance." I looked at the woman who had given birth to me. I looked at the dark red wine dripping slowly from the edge of the table onto the hardwood floor, perfectly mirroring the bleeding heart I had carried for this family for 30 years. She wasn't asking for a favor. She was demanding a tribute. In her mind, my success, my grief, my intellect, and my capital were merely resources to be harvested for Jamal's comfort. "I'm not signing anything, Vivian," I said, my voice softer now, stripped of all emotion, cold and impenetrable. "The foreclosure proceedings will begin tomorrow. They have 48 hours to vacate my property." Vivian's face contorted into an ugly sneer. She leaned across the table, her heavy gold necklace swaying. "If you refuse to do this, Kendra, I swear to God I will destroy you. I will go to your new corporate partners. I will go to the Atlanta media. I will tell them exactly what kind of person you are. I will tell the world that you neglected your grieving process, that you exploited the tragic death of your husband, and that you used his life insurance payout to fund a selfish tech startup while shutting out your own family. I will paint you as a cold, calculating widow who profited off a tragedy. I will ruin your reputation before you even get a chance to enjoy a single dime of that money." The sheer depravity of her threat hung in the air, a putrid stench that mingled with the smell of the spilled wine and the roasted duck sitting untouched on our plates. She was willing to weaponize the darkest, most agonizing chapter of my life to save Jamal's ego. I felt my 4-year-old son, Leo, shift slightly beside me, sensing the heavy tension. I gently placed my hand over his small knee, anchoring him, anchoring myself. I didn't break eye contact with Vivian. I calmly reached into my tailored leather tote bag resting on the floor beside my chair. I withdrew a thick, heavily sealed banking dossier, bound with rigid legal tape. I placed it gently onto the mahogany table, right next to Jamal's foreclosure notice. "The secret you think you are holding over my head is nothing but a desperate delusion, Vivian," I said, my tone as sharp and precise as a surgical scalpel. "But the secret I am holding right here in this folder, this is a federal crime." I shifted my gaze to the far end of the table, past the spilled wine, past Jamal's trembling frame, and locked my eyes onto my father. Harrison had not spoken a single word since I uttered the number 600 million. The righteous, morally superior church deacon, the man who stood at the pulpit every Sunday preaching about integrity and family values, was currently glued to his leather chair, a thick layer of cold sweat glistening on his forehead. His hands were shaking so violently he had tucked them firmly beneath his thighs to hide the tremors. "Tell them, Harrison," I commanded, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Tell your perfect, fiercely protective wife and your golden son exactly what is inside these banking documents." Harrison swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, pathetic wheeze escaped. His eyes darted toward the front door, as if calculating the distance for an escape. "Fine, since the deacon seems to have lost his voice. Allow me to testify," I said, leaning back and crossing my arms over my chest. 4 years ago, when my husband David was killed by that drunk driver, my world ended. I was 8.5 months pregnant. The trauma of the police knocking on my door at 3 a.m. triggered severe preeclampsia. I was rushed to the hospital. While David was being placed in a body bag, I was being cut open in an emergency operating room. I spent 2 weeks in the intensive care unit, hovering between life and death, entirely unable to attend the funeral of the man I loved. David was a careful man. He loved me. He loved his unborn son. He had a comprehensive life insurance policy worth $1 million, designed specifically to ensure that if anything ever happened to him, Leo and I would never have to worry about a roof over our heads. I paused, letting the memory of those blindingly white hospital lights, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitors, and the crushing, suffocating weight of my grief fill the room. The air felt brittle, ready to snap. While I was unconscious, hooked up to ventilators and blood pressure cuffs, my loving father, Harrison, came to visit me. Or rather, he came to visit my purse. He generously offered to handle all the tedious paperwork for the funeral and the estate so I could focus on healing. But what he actually did was take a blank power of attorney document, forge my signature, and have it illegally notarized by a corrupt clerk in his congregation. He then marched into the insurance broker's office and quietly, efficiently, siphoned $600,000 directly out of my husband's death benefit. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Vivian whipped her head around to look at her husband, her eyes wide with a horrific realization. "Harrison," she whispered, her voice cracking. "What is she talking about?" I didn't let him answer. "He didn't take that blood money to donate to the church, Vivian. He didn't put it in a trust for my son. He didn't even invest it. He took $600,000 of a dead man's money and wired it directly into the failing, bankrupt business accounts of Lux Impressions." I snapped my gaze over to Lauren, whose face had now transformed from pale shock to a sickly grayish green. "He gave my husband's money to your precious white daughter-in-law to save her pathetic vanity boutique from going under. He committed a federal felony, risking decades in a penitentiary just to keep Lauren happy, to keep her from leaving Jamal, and to maintain the absolute lie that this branch of the family is successful." The revelation dropped like an unexploded bomb in the center of the table. Vivian's face crumpled. The illusion of her perfect, respectable husband, the man whose arm she proudly held at every charity gala, disintegrated before her eyes. She had threatened to destroy my reputation with a lie, only to discover her husband had already destroyed their entire reality with a truth. Jamal turned slowly, his neck cracking in the silence, to look at his wife. "Lauren?" Jamal's voice was a guttural rasp. "My dad funded your store. You told me you secured an angel investor in New York. You told me—" "She lied, Jamal," I cut in smoothly. "She lies as easily as she breathes. Your father bought her loyalty with my tragedy." But Lauren, ever the survivalist, realized she was cornered. The elegant, condescending sister-in-law vanished, replaced by the cornered, dangerous animal she truly was. She suddenly leaped up from her chair, her silk dress knocking over a side plate. She reached into her clutch and pulled out her smartphone, her fingers flying frantically across the screen. She flipped the phone around, the bright screen illuminating her panicked face, and pointed the camera directly at me. Her entire demeanor shifted in a split second, tears instantly welling up in her eyes as she forced a hysterical, hyperventilating sob from her chest. "You are insane!" Lauren screamed, her voice pitched perfectly for the microphone. "You are making all of this up to extort us. I am going live right now. I have 400,000 followers on Instagram, Kendra. I am going to show the entire world what is happening here. I am going to tell them that an unstable, aggressive black woman has forced her way into my home on Christmas Eve, that she is threatening my family with forged documents, and that she is trying to extort us for money. Let's see who the police and my brand sponsors believe when they see you sitting in my dining room harassing a terrified family." She hovered her thumb over the glowing red "Go Live" button, tears streaming down her carefully powdered cheeks, fully prepared to weaponize the tears of a terrified white woman against a calm, collected black woman. It was a societal trump card she had likely played a dozen times before, confident that the optics would automatically grant her the status of the victim. She expected me to panic. She expected me to lunge across the table to grab the phone, providing her with the exact footage of aggression she needed to validate her lie. I didn't move a muscle. I casually leaned back against the plush upholstery of my chair, picked up my ceramic coffee cup, and took a long, slow sip of the lukewarm dark roast. I strongly advise you to take a moment and remember exactly what it is I actually do for a living before you press that button, Lauren, I said quietly. My company didn't just build basic firewalls. We specialized in high-level, military-grade cybersecurity, deep data encryption, and federal digital forensics. We track ghosts in the machine. If you want to go live and invite the world into your digital life, I am more than happy to facilitate the connection. I calmly reached into my pocket, bypassing the theatricality of her panic, and pulled out my own sleek matte black smartphone. I didn't look at her. I looked down at my screen. My thumb swiped across the glass, executing 3 pre-programmed security bypass commands I had prepared before I even pulled my car into their gated driveway. I didn't need to hack their network, their home security, their Wi-Fi, their smart devices. It was all consumer-grade trash with default admin passwords. A soft electronic chime echoed through the house. Immediately, the massive 70-inch smart television mounted on the custom stone fireplace in the adjoining living room roared to life. The sudden burst of bright blue light threw harsh, shifting shadows across the dining room walls. Everyone at the table jumped, their heads whipping around to look at the screen. It wasn't playing a holiday movie. It wasn't displaying a screensaver. The massive screen was currently projecting a live, highly organized mirror of Lauren's private encrypted cloud storage drive. Spreadsheets, wire transfer receipts, and confidential email chains were tiled perfectly across the 70 inches of high-definition glass. "Let's give your 400,000 followers a real show, Lauren," I said, pointing a steady finger toward the living room. "Let's show them these ledgers." Lauren gasped, a sharp, ragged intake of air as she dropped her phone onto the table. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it looked as though she were watching her own execution. "Lauren hasn't just been failing at running her boutique, Jamal," I said, my voice echoing off the walls, narrating the brutal digital evidence illuminating the room. "She's been quietly, systematically embezzling money from your logistics company for the past 24 months. Look at the screen. She didn't just drain your personal accounts. She set up phantom vendors and fake invoicing software in Delaware. She has been funneling the operating capital of your company straight into a network of shell corporations." Jamal pushed himself up from his chair, his legs shaking so badly he had to lean his weight entirely on the table. He stumbled toward the living room archway, staring up at the screen like a man reading his own autopsy report. "What is this?" Jamal choked out, his eyes scanning the endless rows of 6-figure wire transfers. "Lauren, what is this?" "It gets better, brother," I continued, my voice relentless, pressing down on the accelerator of their destruction. "She didn't keep the money in the country. If you look at the subfolder on the top right, you'll see the routing numbers for her secret offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and a private vault in Switzerland. She has entirely gutted your company. That's why you haven't been able to pay the mortgage. It wasn't the economy, it was your wife. And if you look at the email chain displayed right in the center, the one dated 6 months ago, you will see her correspondence with Robert Kincaid. He is a premier cutthroat divorce attorney based in Manhattan. She paid his $50,000 retainer using your company's payroll funds. Lauren has been planning to file for divorce, drain the last remaining drops of your credit, and flee the state with the stolen capital, leaving you with a collapsed business, massive federal tax liabilities, and a foreclosed mansion. I let the weight of the digital truth crush the remaining oxygen out of the room. The glowing television screen cast a cold, clinical light on the faces of my family. My father, the thief, sat frozen in silent shame. My mother, the enabler, stared in horror as the perfect legacy she had sacrificed my sanity to protect evaporated into thin air. Lauren, the parasite, stood completely immobilized, stripped of all her leverage, her lies laid bare in high definition, and Jamal, the golden boy, the king of the castle, dropped to his knees on the hardwood floor, clutching his chest as he realized that the woman he had loved, the woman my parents had committed felonies to protect, was the architect of his absolute and total destruction. They had spent 4 years calling me a freeloader, mocking my grief and treating my existence as an embarrassment. They had underestimated the quiet woman in the corner. They had mistaken my silence for weakness. They had no idea that while they were busy playing house with stolen money, I had been building an empire, and now I own them all. The harsh artificial blue light from the 70-inch television screen bathed the dining room in a cold, clinical glow, transforming the opulent space into an interrogation room where the executioner was not a person, but an undeniable sequence of digital data. Jamal remained on his knees on the polished hardwood floor, his chest heaving with shallow, erratic breaths as his eyes darted frantically across the glowing spreadsheets, wire transfer confirmations, and the damning email thread with the Manhattan divorce attorney. The silence in the room had morphed from shock into a thick, suffocating dread, broken only by the soft, rhythmic hum of the television's cooling fan and the faint sound of my son, Leo, shifting comfortably in his chair beside me. I did not rush to fill the silence. I let it stretch, allowing the absolute gravity of Lauren's betrayal to crush the last remaining fragments of Jamal's manufactured ego. He slowly pulled his hands down his face, his skin pale and slick with a sudden cold sweat as the reality of his utter ruin settled into his bones. "Lauren," Jamal whispered, his voice stripped of all its former booming authority, reduced to the fragile, trembling rasp of a broken man. You paid a divorce lawyer with my payroll account? You set up shell companies in Delaware, while I was sitting here defending you, while my parents were—" He couldn't finish the sentence. He turned his head slowly, the tendons in his neck standing out in stark relief, and looked at the woman he had paraded as his trophy, the woman for whom my father had committed a federal felony just to keep in the lifestyle she demanded. Lauren was backed against the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles white as she gripped the wood, her eyes wide and feral like a cornered predator. The mask of the sophisticated, concerned sister-in-law had completely dissolved, leaving behind a terrified, calculating opportunist whose escape pod had just been blown to pieces in front of her. She looked at the screen, then at Jamal, and then, inexplicably, she looked at me with a venomous, blistering hatred, as if I were the one who had forced her hand into the company coffers. "It wasn't like that!" Lauren suddenly shrieked, the sound sharp and desperate, shattering the quiet of the room. "Jamal, you have to listen to me. Your company was dying anyway. You are a terrible CEO. You were bleeding money, making stupid investments, trying to act like you were some titan of industry when you couldn't even manage a simple supply chain. I was just protecting myself. I was securing my future because you were driving us straight into a brick wall. What was I supposed to do? Go down with your sinking ship?" Her admission, wrapped in a frantic, selfish justification, was the final strike against the glass house they had all built. Jamal let out a sound that was half sob, half growl, a pathetic, guttural noise of absolute defeat. He didn't lunge at her. He didn't scream. He just stared at the floor, utterly paralyzed by the magnitude of his own foolishness. But the true psychological spectacle was unfolding at the other end of the table. My mother, Vivian, who had spent the last 30 years worshiping at the altar of Jamal's potential, was watching her entire universe collapse in real time. Her eyes flicked from the damning evidence on the screen to her broken son on the floor, to her thieving husband sweating in his chair, and finally, slowly, inevitably, to me, I watched the frantic calculations happening behind her eyes. Vivian was a woman who only understood relationships through the lens of leverage and capital. For 4 years, I had been the useless, grieving widow who brought nothing to the table. Jamal had been the king. But in the span of 15 minutes, the king had been exposed as a bankrupt, cuckolded fool, and the peasant had just casually revealed a net worth of $600 million and total legal control over the roof above their heads. The pivot was instantaneous, sickening, and flawless. Vivian stood up, smoothing the front of her ruined, wine-stained dress with trembling hands. She deliberately turned her back on Jamal and Lauren, stepping over the spilled wine as if stepping over a corpse, and walked toward my end of the table. Her face, which just moments ago had been twisted in venomous hatred, suddenly softened into a grotesque, exaggerated mask of maternal affection. She forced a bright, sickeningly sweet smile onto her lips, her eyes crinkling at the corners in a horrifying display of manufactured warmth. "Kendra, my beautiful, brilliant daughter," Vivian cooed, her voice dripping with a syrupy cadence that made my stomach physically churn. She reached out, her hands fluttering in the air, as if she wanted to embrace me, though she wisely stopped short of actually making contact. We honestly had no idea. We were completely blind. We didn't know Lauren was such a toxic, manipulative snake. She had us all fooled. She poisoned this family. And your father... Harrison's actions are unforgivable. I am just as shocked as you are. He will be stepping down from the church immediately, and he will disown Jamal for bringing this trash into our lives." She gestured wildly toward the other end of the room, completely discarding the son she had worshipped for 4 decades the moment his bank account hit zero. "We will throw Lauren out tonight. We will clean house. You are the true pride of this family, Kendra. You always have been. You built an empire from nothing, just like your grandfather. Please let your father and me help you manage this incredible blessing. We can build a true legacy together. We can protect you and little Leo from people who just want your money." I remained perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on my lap, feeling the absolute icy detachment radiating from my core. I looked at this woman, this stranger who shared my blood, and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow, just the cold, sterile observation of a parasite trying to attach itself to a new, wealthier host. She wasn't apologizing for how she had treated me. She was auditioning for a position in my new tax bracket. I slowly reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out 3 thick, crisply folded legal documents. I placed them side by side on the pristine mahogany surface, the heavy paper making a soft, authoritative sound. I didn't look at Vivian. I looked straight ahead, addressing the entire room. "I do not require a relationship with criminals, Vivian," I said, my voice dropping an octave, carrying the terrifying, immovable weight of absolute finality. "And I certainly do not require your help to manage the wealth I built while you were busy mocking my grief." I tapped a perfectly manicured fingernail against the first document. Document number 1. This is a legally binding repayment schedule for the $600,000 that Harrison and you stole from my husband's life insurance policy, calculated with the maximum compound interest allowable under federal law. You will make monthly deposits directly into an escrow account managed by my legal team. If you miss a single payment, if a check bounces, or if you are even 1 day late, my attorneys have pre-signed authorization to immediately file federal wire fraud, grand larceny, and forgery charges against both of you. You will spend your retirement in a federal penitentiary." Harrison let out a soft, whimpering moan from the end of the table, burying his face in his hands, but I didn't pause. I moved my finger to the second document. Document number 2. This is the official, court-approved notice of eviction and property seizure for this estate, executed by Vanguard Holdings, LLC. Jamal, Lauren, you have exactly 48 hours to remove your personal belongings from my property. You are not to touch the fixtures, the appliances, or the art. If there is a single scratch on the hardwood floors, or if any of the copper wiring is missing when my inspectors arrive on December 26th, I will personally ensure the district attorney adds vandalism and destruction of property to your impending embezzlement charges, Lauren. I finally looked at my brother, who was still kneeling on the floor, staring at the eviction notice as if it were written in a dead language. I moved my finger to the third and final document, bearing the heavy embossed seal of the county court. And document number 3. This is a comprehensive, zero-tolerance restraining order. It legally prohibits every single person in this room from coming within 500 yards of me, my son, my primary residence, or any of my corporate offices. It legally forbids you from using my name, my likeness, the name of my former company, or my son's name to solicit funds, secure loans, or leverage social standing in your pathetic country club circles. As of this exact second, you are legally and financially dead to me. This bloodline ends here, in this room, tonight. The absolute brutal finality of my words hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. I had not screamed. I had not thrown a single plate. I had simply dismantled their entire existence with the quiet, devastating precision of a surgeon removing a cancerous tumor. Vivian's fake smile vanished, her mouth hanging open in a silent scream of disbelief as she realized that her final, desperate gamble had failed completely. The golden goose was walking away, and it was taking the farm with it. It was in that exact moment of suffocating silence that Jamal's broken mind finally snapped. The realization that he had lost his wife, his company, his wealth, his home, and his family's respect all in the span of 20 minutes overloaded his fragile, ego-driven psychology. He let out a primal guttural roar, a terrifying animalistic sound of pure, unadulterated rage and humiliation. He scrambled up from the floor, his eyes completely black with fury, his tailored suit jacket ripping at the shoulder as he launched himself across the dining room table directly toward me. His hands outstretched like claws, desperate to tear the legal documents, to tear me, to destroy the architect of his ruin. "You think you can do this to me, Kendra?" Jamal screamed, his voice cracking violently, spit flying from his lips as he vaulted over the mahogany, knocking crystal glasses and silverware to the floor in a shattering cascade. "I am the head of this family. I will kill you!" But I did not flinch. I did not move backward. I simply picked up my ceramic coffee cup. Before his fingers could even graze the edge of the legal documents, the heavy double oak doors of the dining room exploded inward with a deafening crash. 2 massive, broad-shouldered men in immaculate black suits, the elite private security contractors I had hired weeks ago and stationed silently in the hallway the moment I arrived, surged into the room with terrifying mechanical efficiency. The first operative intercepted Jamal mid-lunge, wrapping a thick, muscular arm around my brother's throat and utilizing the momentum of Jamal's own frantic leap to slam him brutally face first into the hardwood floor. The sickening crack of Jamal's nose breaking echoed through the room, immediately followed by the sharp metallic click of a tactical zip tie being secured aggressively around his wrists behind his back. The second operative stepped fluidly between me and the rest of the table, his hand resting casually but menacingly on the grip of the taser holstered at his belt, his cold professional eyes scanning Vivian, Harrison, and Lauren, daring any of them to make a sudden movement. Vivian shrieked, clutching her chest, while Harrison scrambled backward in his chair, completely terrified by the sudden influx of violent, controlled authority. Jamal thrashed helplessly on the floor, blood pouring from his nose onto the expensive rug, weeping loudly in pain and absolute total humiliation. I calmly finished the last sip of my coffee, placed the ceramic cup gently onto its saucer, and stood up from the table. I smoothed the non-existent wrinkles from my wool trousers, picked up the 3 signed legal documents, and slid them safely back into my leather tote bag. I reached down, took my son Leo's small, warm hand in mine, and helped him down from his chair. I did not look at my mother's horrified face. I did not look at my father's cowardly tears. I did not look at Lauren's paralyzed terror. I looked down at the bleeding, thrashing man on the floor who used to be my brother, the man who had ordered me out of his house just moments before. Make sure they fully understand the exact parameters of the 48-hour eviction window, I said calmly to the security operative pinning Jamal down, my voice devoid of any pity or hesitation. If they are not gone by the deadline, or if they attempt to contact me, arrest them for trespassing and violation of a court order. Do not let them follow me to the car. The operative gave a sharp single nod. Understood, ma'am. I turned my back on the wreckage of my bloodline and walked out of the suffocating, toxic atmosphere of the mansion. The heavy oak front doors swung open, and the crisp, freezing winter air of Atlanta hit my face, feeling cleaner and purer than any breath I had taken in the last 4 years. The massive, armored black SUV was already idling silently at the curb, the exhaust pluming white in the cold night, the driver standing at attention by the open rear door. I buckled Leo into his plush, heated leather car seat, wrapping his warm dinosaur blanket tightly around his shoulders. I climbed into the spacious, quiet cabin beside him, the heavy door closing with a solid, isolating thud that completely severed the sounds of the screaming and the sirens that I knew would soon follow. The interior of the car smelled of rich leather and the faint, comforting scent of my own expensive perfume. Leo looked up at me, his bright, innocent eyes completely untouched by the carnage I had just orchestrated, holding his half-colored reindeer napkin. "Was dinner good tonight, Mommy?" Leo asked, his voice soft and sweet. I looked out the tinted window at the sprawling, lit-up mansion that no longer belonged to my abusers, feeling the immense, crushing weight of their expectations, their insults, and their parasitic demands finally lift from my shoulders, dissipating into the dark winter sky. I smiled, a genuine, deeply felt smile that reached all the way to my eyes for the first time since my husband died. I pulled my son close, kissing the top of his head as the SUV smoothly pulled away from the curb, leaving the ruins of my past far behind. "Yes, my love," I whispered into the quiet, warm space of our new reality. "It was the best dinner of my entire life. We're finally going home." The heavily armored black SUV glided smoothly through the freezing, silent streets of the Atlanta suburbs, the heated leather seats providing a stark, comforting contrast to the icy, suffocating atmosphere of the dining room I had just systematically dismantled. I watched the sprawling, brightly lit mansions of Jamal's neighborhood blur past the tinted windows, each one a monument to the same fragile, debt-fueled egos that had just shattered on my brother's hardwood floor. Beside me, Leo was already fast asleep, his small, steady breaths fogging the cold glass of the window, his tiny hands clutching the edges of his fleece dinosaur blanket. I gently brushed a soft curl from his forehead, my thumb tracing the relaxed curve of his cheek. For the first time in 4 years, I wasn't bracing myself for a late-night phone call demanding I fix a crisis I didn't create. I wasn't mentally calculating how to stretch my remaining savings to cover an emergency loan my mother would borrow and never repay. I was simply a mother riding in the back of a vehicle I owned, returning to an empire I had built with my own 2 hands in the dark. We left the manicured subdivisions behind and entered the dense, heavily wooded enclaves of Buckhead, where true wealth didn't advertise itself with loud parties and open gates. My driver, a silent, impeccably trained professional, turned onto a private, unmarked access road lined with ancient, towering oak trees whose bare winter branches formed a protective canopy against the night sky. At the end of the half-mile drive, a massive wrought-iron security gate silently rolled open, recognizing the encrypted proximity signal from the vehicle. Beyond the gates lay my actual sanctuary, a breathtaking, ultra-modern estate constructed of dark stone, floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass, and warm architectural timber. It was completely hidden from the world, nestled within 10 acres of private forest. There were no neighbors to perform for. There was no family to judge the square footage. There was only the fortress I had designed to protect my peace. As the SUV pulled into the heated motor court, the front doors of the estate opened, and my night staff, a discreet, highly compensated team who respected my silence, stepped forward to assist. I carried Leo inside myself, refusing to relinquish the weight of my son, feeling the soft, solid thud of my low-heeled boots against the imported slate entryway. The house smelled faintly of burning cedar wood from the massive living room fireplace and the soothing, earthy aroma of expensive sandalwood diffusers. It was the scent of absolute security. I walked up the floating glass staircase to Leo's suite, gently laying him down on his plush, orthopedic mattress, pulling the heavy duvet over his shoulders. I stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest under the soft glow of a nightlight, feeling a profound, overwhelming wave of vindication wash over me. I had done it. I had survived the darkest, most agonizing chapter of my existence, and I had shielded him from the fallout. I softly closed his door and walked down the long, dimly lit hallway toward my own master wing, my fingers trailing lightly against the cool, smooth texture of the gallery walls. I stripped off my tailored wool trousers and my cashmere coat, letting the garments that had served as my armor for the evening fall away. I stepped into a massive, glass-enclosed rain shower, turning the water temperature up until the steam completely filled the room, standing under the scalding cascade until the last lingering sensation of Vivian's fake syrupy smile and Jamal's violent rage was entirely scrubbed from my skin. I wrapped myself in a heavy, floor-length silk robe, tying the sash tightly around my waist, and walked barefoot down to my kitchen. It was a massive, minimalist space of dark matte cabinetry and seamless white marble. The silence of the house was absolute, heavy and deeply restorative. I filled a copper kettle, the soft rush of the water sounding incredibly loud in the quiet room. As I waited for it to boil, I leaned against the cold marble island, resting my forehead against my hand. The adrenaline of the confrontation was finally beginning to ebb, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. But it was a clean exhaustion. It wasn't the toxic, soul-draining fatigue of trying to appease unappeasable people. It was the satisfying soreness of a warrior who had just won the final battle and laid down her sword. I poured the boiling water over a delicate blend of loose-leaf chamomile and lavender, watching the dried petals swirl and bloom in the fine porcelain cup. I carried the tea out to the expansive, glass-enclosed terrace that overlooked the dark, sprawling acreage of my backyard. The moon was high and cold, casting pale silver shadows across the frost-covered grass. I sat down in a deep cushioned armchair, wrapping my cold hands around the warm porcelain, and finally allowed myself to look back at the treacherous path that had led me to this exact moment of quiet sovereignty. 4 years. It felt like 4 lifetimes. When the police officers stood on my crumbling front porch in the middle of that rainy Tuesday night, their badges reflecting the flashing blue lights of their cruiser, and told me that my husband David was dead, my entire universe violently collapsed into a microscopic singularity of pain. The severe preeclampsia that struck me hours later was just my body attempting to physically mirror the absolute destruction of my soul. I woke up 2 weeks later in a sterile ICU room, hooked to a maze of plastic tubing with a newborn son in the NICU and a husband in a graveyard. I had never felt a loneliness so vast, so incredibly dark that it physically suffocated me. And in that terrifying darkness, I looked to the people who shared my blood. I looked to the family that had always demanded my time, my energy, and my submission. I expected a safety net. I expected a circle of protection. Instead, I found a pack of scavengers. I remembered the day I finally came home from the hospital, barely able to walk, carrying a fragile 4-pound infant. Vivian didn't bring groceries. She didn't offer to hold Leo so I could sleep. She walked into my small, drafty townhouse, ran a critical finger over the dust on the entryway table, and immediately began complaining about how Lauren's boutique was struggling and how Jamal was so stressed about his new promotion. She sat on my secondhand sofa and asked me, while I was actively bleeding and weeping for my dead husband, If I could take out a personal line of credit to help Jamal with a down payment on a new luxury car he felt he deserved for his new CEO title. When I quietly refused, citing my hospital bills, the mask of the loving mother vanished. She called me selfish. She said David's death was making me bitter and uncooperative. That was the exact moment the cord snapped. It wasn't a loud break. It was a silent internal severing of all emotional expectation. I realized then with a terrifying clarity that to them I was not a daughter. I was not a grieving widow. I was a resource. I was the unbreakable foundation they felt entitled to chip away at, to build their own castles. If I showed them my wounds, they wouldn't bandage them. They would complain that the blood was staining their shoes. So I stopped bleeding out loud. I built a fortress of absolute silence. I let them believe I was broken, lazy, and stagnant. I accepted their passive-aggressive insults at Sunday dinners without retaliation. I let Lauren mock my basement hobbies while I served her appetizers. I camouflaged my survival behind flawless grace, pressed suits, and polite, detached nods. And every single night after Leo was finally asleep, after the tears had dried on my face, I would sit on the cold hardwood floor of my living room, open my laptop, and channel every ounce of my grief, my rage, and my intellect into the architecture of my company. I built complex data encryption matrices. I designed predictive threat analysis algorithms that could identify federal cyber breaches before they even breached the outermost firewalls. I didn't build a startup. I built an impregnable digital vault, pouring all my need for safety into lines of flawless code. For 4 years, I operated in total stealth. When the military contractors came calling, offering hundreds of millions for my intellectual property, I didn't celebrate with champagne. I quietly signed the non-disclosure agreements, established Vanguard holdings under layers of corporate anonymity, and systematically began buying up the debt of the people who had treated me like dirt. I wanted them to feel the exact level of helplessness they had forced upon me, but I wanted it to be entirely legal, flawlessly executed, and impossible to escape. And tonight, the trap had finally snapped shut. The chime of my encrypted secure tablet, resting on the side table next to my tea, pulled me out of the past and back into the crisp, cold reality of the present. It was 3:45 a.m. on Christmas morning. The world outside was perfectly still, but the digital world I commanded was buzzing with frantic, desperate activity. I picked up the heavy titanium-cased tablet and unlocked it with a biometric scan. The screen illuminated, displaying a high-priority message from Marcus, the stoic ex-military head of my private security detail who had personally broken Jamal's nose hours earlier. He wasn't sleeping either. "Ma'am, immediate post-incident briefing compiled. The targets are active." I tapped the screen, opening the detailed surveillance and financial intercept logs. It was a fascinating, pathetic psychological study of parasites who had suddenly realized their host was not only immune, but lethal. Jamal had not gone home. The security operatives had escorted him directly from the dining room floor to an ambulance. According to the intercepted medical admission logs at Emory University Hospital, his nose wasn't just broken. It was severely fractured, requiring immediate surgical realignment. He was currently heavily sedated in a private recovery room, his jaw wired, completely unable to speak, command, or threaten anyone. The golden king of the family was spending Christmas morning breathing through a plastic tube, entirely alone. Lauren, predictably, had abandoned her husband the moment the illusion of his wealth evaporated. The GPS tracker my team had discreetly cloned from her phone showed she had taken an Uber XL straight from the mansion to the Waldorf Astoria in Buckhead, checking into a $2,000 a night luxury suite using a backup corporate credit card. But the financial intercepts showed her true desperation. At 1:15 a.m., 2:30 a.m., and 3:10 a.m., she had frantically attempted to access the offshore Cayman Island accounts where she had been hoarding the money embezzled from Jamal's logistics firm. She was trying to wire the remaining capital to an untraceable cryptocurrency wallet to facilitate her escape from the state. What she didn't know was that my digital forensics team had already flagged those specific routing numbers with international banking authorities under the Patriot Act, citing credible suspicion of major corporate wire fraud. Every single transfer request she initiated bounced back with a terrifying red error code. Account frozen, pending federal investigation. She was trapped in a gilded cage, staring at millions of dollars she could no longer touch, waiting for the inevitable knock on her hotel room door. But it was the activity log from my parents, Vivian and Harrison, that made my jaw clench in the silent darkness of my terrace. They had not gone to a hotel. They had returned to their own meticulously decorated, upper-middle-class home, a home I now knew was heavily mortgaged to maintain their country club facade. The digital footprint from their IP address showed they had spent the entire night frantically searching for criminal defense attorneys, specializing in federal fraud and forgery. They had visited the websites of the top 20 law firms in Atlanta, but they wouldn't find representation. Weeks ago, I had systematically paid massive, non-refundable consultation retainers to every single elite white-collar defense attorney in the state of Georgia to review potential future corporate conflicts, effectively legally conflicting out the best legal minds in the city from ever representing Vivian or Harrison against me. They were legally isolated, drowning in the shallow end of a pool they thought they owned. However, cornered rats do not simply surrender. They look for a different way to bite. I scrolled down to the final alert on Marcus's report. It was an intercepted audio log from Harrison's cell phone. Desperate, terrified of the impending criminal charges for stealing the $600,000 from David's life insurance, Vivian had ripped the phone from her husband's hands and made a call at 3:30 a.m. She didn't call a lawyer. She called Robert Vance. My blood ran completely cold, the warmth of the tea instantly vanishing from my system. Robert Vance was David's estranged father. He was a bitter, wealthy, fiercely litigious man who had despised me from the day David married me, believing his son had married beneath his station. He had attempted to block our marriage, and when David died, Robert had tried to claim the life insurance money for himself, only to be legally blocked by the pristine, airtight policy David had written, protecting me and Leo. Robert hadn't spoken to me in 4 years. I tapped the audio file. The recording was crystal clear, captured by the deep-level surveillance worm my team had planted on Vivian's device. "Robert, it's Vivian." My mother's voice crackled through the speaker, trembling with a horrific, manipulative desperation. "I know it's the middle of the night, and I know we haven't spoken since the funeral. But I am calling you because your grandson, Leo, is in terrible, terrible danger. Kendra has completely lost her mind. She has suffered a massive psychological break. She's aggressive, violent, and completely unstable. She just hired armed thugs to attack my son on Christmas Eve. Robert, she is hoarding David's money, and she is isolating that little boy in a dangerous environment. You have the money and the lawyers. If you file for emergency grandparents' custody of Leo tomorrow morning, I swear to you on a stack of Bibles, Harrison and I will testify against Kendra in family court. We will say whatever you need us to say to prove she is an unfit mother. We will help you take the boy, but we need your legal protection in return. She is trying to ruin us." The audio file clicked off, plunging the terrace back into absolute silence. I sat perfectly still in the dark, the silk of my robe feeling suddenly heavy against my skin. The sheer, unfathomable evil of her negotiation hung in the air like poison gas. Vivian was entirely willing to orchestrate the legal kidnapping of my 4-year-old son, handing him over to a ruthless, emotionally abusive man who hated me, just to create a bargaining chip to escape her own federal forgery charges. She was willing to destroy Leo's life just to save her own country club membership. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the porcelain teacup against the reinforced glass. The time for emotional reactions was completely over. The quiet sovereignty I had maintained was no longer just a shield. It was about to become a weapon of mass, unrestricted destruction. I closed the audio file and opened a direct encrypted messaging channel to Marcus. My fingers flew across the glass keyboard to the child. Execute Phase 3. Do not wait for the morning. I want Vanguard Holdings' legal team to file the federal criminal indictments for fraud and forgery against Harrison and Vivian the second the courthouse servers open at 8:00 a.m. I want the IRS tipped off regarding Lauren's offshore accounts immediately, and send the extraction team to Jamal's property right now. I don't care that it is 4 a.m. on Christmas. Throw their belongings onto the street and change the locks. I hit send, watching the message encrypt and disappear into the digital ether. Marcus replied less than 5 seconds later. Orders received. Phase 3 initiated. Extraction team is 10 minutes out from the Vanguard property. I took a deep, slow breath, feeling the cold air fill my lungs. I was about to close the tablet and try to get a few hours of sleep before Leo woke up to open his presents, when a sudden, jarring red notification slashed across the top of my screen. It wasn't a message from Marcus. It was an automated, high-priority alert from the Vanguard Holdings internal monitoring system. Weeks ago, when Vanguard officially acquired the deed to Jamal's mansion, I had my security contractors discreetly install microscopic, military-grade motion sensors and infrared cameras in the primary blind spots of the house, hallways, basements, and private offices, just to monitor the asset. The red alert was coming from Jamal's basement study. I tapped the notification, and a live, high-definition, infrared video feed immediately populated the screen. The study was pitch black, but the night vision camera illuminated the room in a crisp, ghostly green glow. Someone was in the house. It wasn't the security team. It was Lauren. She hadn't stayed at the Waldorf, driven by a desperation that overrode all logic. She had sneaked back into the mansion while Jamal was recovering in the hospital, but she wasn't upstairs packing her designer shoes or her expensive jewelry. She was in the basement. She was wearing dark athletic clothes, her hair tied back in a messy knot, and she was gripping a heavy 2-foot-long iron crowbar. I watched, absolutely mesmerized by the sheer audacity of the betrayal, as Lauren swung the crowbar with vicious, frantic strength, smashing it directly into the expensive mahogany drywall paneling directly behind Jamal's massive oak desk. Plaster and wood splintered in the green light, raining down onto the carpet. She swung again and again, tearing a massive hole in the wall, panting heavily, her face twisted in a mask of pure greed. She reached into the shattered drywall and violently yanked away the remaining debris, revealing a heavy, dull gray steel wall safe hidden entirely out of sight. I sat up straight, my eyes narrowing. I had reviewed every single blueprint, every appraisal, and every financial disclosure related to that property. There was no safe registered to that house. Jamal had hidden it, and Lauren knew exactly where it was. She dropped the crowbar, her hands shaking violently as she reached out to the digital keypad on the safe. She didn't hesitate. She didn't guess. She rapidly punched in a 6-digit code. The camera's zoom function was powerful enough to catch the exact movement of her fingers on the keypad. 081489. I froze, the blood rushing in my ears, drowning out the silence of my terrace. That wasn't a random combination. That wasn't Jamal's birthday. That wasn't their anniversary. August 14th, 1989. That was my late husband David's exact date of birth. The heavy steel bolts of the hidden safe clicked open with a hollow thud, and Lauren desperately yanked the heavy door wide open, reaching her hands into the darkness inside, completely unaware that I was watching every single move from the silence of my throne. I leaned closer to the glowing screen of my encrypted tablet, the cold night air of the terrace entirely forgotten as I watched the high-definition infrared feed from the basement of the Vanguard property. The heavy steel door of the hidden wall safe swung open with a hollow metallic groan that the microscopic audio receptors picked up with terrifying clarity. Lauren did not hesitate. She reached both hands into the dark cavity, her breathing ragged and frantic, and began pulling out thick, vacuum-sealed bricks of $100 bills. It was a staggering amount of physical currency, easily $250,000 stacked in neat banded rows. My eyes narrowed in the darkness of my sanctuary. Jamal's logistics company was hemorrhaging capital, facing massive federal tax liabilities and defaulting on its commercial mortgages. Yet here was the golden child, hoarding untraceable cash inside the walls of a house he couldn't even afford. They were a perfect toxic match, a husband hiding liquid assets from his embezzling wife, and a wife siphoning corporate funds to hide from her bankrupt husband. Their entire marriage was a grotesque financial Cold War, and they had both lost. But Lauren didn't stop at the money. After aggressively shoving the bricks of cash into her designer duffel bag, her hands darted back into the back of the safe, pulling out a thick, worn leather portfolio. She paused, her greed momentarily overriding her panic, and fumbled for the wall switch. The basement lights flickered on, instantly blowing out the green infrared feed and forcing the Vanguard surveillance camera to seamlessly transition into crisp, full-color resolution. Lauren unzipped the leather portfolio and dumped its contents onto the glass surface of Jamal's desk. I immediately initiated a digital zoom protocol, magnifying the image until the text on the documents was legible. My breath hitched in my throat, a sharp, cold realization piercing through the lingering exhaustion in my chest. Spread across the desk were not corporate ledgers or property deeds. They were photocopies of the original life insurance claim documents from 4 years ago. Right on top, illuminated by the harsh basement lighting, was the forged power of attorney form bearing my falsified signature, complete with the corrupt notary's official seal. Beneath it were the bank routing confirmations showing the transfer of $600,000 into Lauren's failing boutique. I sat perfectly still, the pieces of a massive, sickening psychological puzzle finally snapping into place. I had always wondered why Vivian and Harrison, despite their obsession with social standing and financial security, had so willingly handed over their entire retirement portfolio and repeatedly committed fraud to keep Jamal's failing logistics company afloat. I had assumed it was simply the toxic blind favoritism of a matriarch worshiping her only male heir. But the truth was infinitely darker, infinitely more pathetic. Jamal wasn't just the golden child, he was their warden. He had somehow discovered what my parents had done with David's life insurance money 4 years ago. Instead of protecting me, instead of exposing the theft, Jamal had quietly gathered the physical evidence, locked it in a hidden safe, and spent the next 4 years using it to systematically blackmail his own mother and father. That was why Vivian defended him so fiercely. That was why Harrison sweated in terror whenever Jamal raised his voice. They weren't protecting a legacy, they were paying a ransom. Jamal had held the threat of federal prison over his parents' heads to fund his extravagant lifestyle, while simultaneously mocking me for being a freeloader. The sheer, unadulterated evil of my bloodline was so profound it almost took my breath away. I wasn't just the family disappointment. I was the only person in that house who wasn't an active participant in a criminal syndicate. Lauren stared at the documents, her eyes wide as she realized the absolute leverage she now held. A manic, triumphant smile stretched across her face. She thought she had just found the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. She thought she could use these documents to extort Jamal in the divorce, to force Vivian and Harrison to take the fall for the embezzlement, to buy her freedom. She began frantically shoving the papers into the duffel bag alongside the cash, zipping it shut with trembling, greedy fingers. She slung the heavy strap over her shoulder and turned to run back up the stairs, completely unaware that the walls were already closing in. On my tablet, a secondary security feed from the front driveway flared to life. 3 black unmarked tactical vehicles silently rolled through the open gates of the mansion, their headlights extinguished, operating entirely under the cover of darkness. The Vanguard Holdings extraction team had arrived. 6 operatives dressed in unmarked heavy tactical gear moved with terrifying fluid precision across the frosted lawn. 2 operatives bypassed the electronic locks on the massive oak front doors in less than 10 seconds, slipping into the main foyer like shadows, while the others secured the perimeter exits. I watched the split-screen feed as Lauren sprinted up the basement stairs, hauling the heavy bag of cash and blackmail material, her face flushed with the adrenaline of her perceived victory. She burst through the basement door into the main hallway, taking exactly 3 steps before she collided with a wall of solid, black-clad muscle. Lauren shrieked, a high-pitched sound of absolute terror, as 2 Vanguard operatives instantly flanked her. She stumbled backward, dropping the duffel bag, which hit the hardwood floor with a heavy, expensive thud. Marcus, the lead operative, stepped forward into the dim light of the hallway. He didn't yell, he didn't draw a weapon. He simply looked at her with the cold, detached professionalism of a man exterminating a pest. "Lauren Vance," Marcus said, his deep voice carrying clearly through the audio feed. "You are currently trespassing on private property owned by Vanguard Holdings, LLC. You are also in the active commission of felony burglary, destruction of corporate property, and the unauthorized removal of assets." Lauren's face contorted into a mask of frantic, desperate entitlement. She puffed out her chest, trying to summon the arrogant, untouchable aura she had worn at the dinner table hours earlier. "Do you know who I am?" she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Marcus's face. "This is my house. My husband owns this house. I am just retrieving my personal belongings. You have no right to be here. I am calling the police right now and having all of you arrested for breaking and entering." Marcus didn't even blink. "The deed to this property transferred to Vanguard Holdings 30 days ago. The eviction notice was formally served to your husband at 8:15 this evening. Furthermore, the property you are attempting to remove is entirely undocumented cash and stolen legal files obtained by violently breaching a structural wall." He gestured slightly with his hand. The 2 operatives beside her moved with lightning speed. Before Lauren could even draw a breath to scream again, her arms were expertly wrenched behind her back, and the sharp metallic ratcheting sound of heavy-duty tactical zip ties echoed through the hallway. "Hey, stop! You're hurting me! You can't do this!" Lauren sobbed hysterically, her legs thrashing wildly as the operatives easily lifted her off the ground, completely neutralizing her. "You are under citizen's arrest for felony trespassing and burglary," Marcus stated calmly, picking up the heavy duffel bag. "The local authorities have already been dispatched to this location by our legal team. We will be handing you and the evidence of your corporate embezzlement directly over to the Atlanta Police Department. Have a seat, ma'am." They deposited her roughly onto one of the expensive silk entryway chairs, where she immediately dissolved into a pathetic, weeping puddle, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face, her mascara running in dark streaks down her cheeks. The invincible, condescending sister-in-law who had mocked my grief and drained my husband's life insurance money was spending Christmas morning zip-tied to her own furniture, waiting for the flashing lights of the police cruisers. I watched the screen for a few more minutes, ensuring the perimeter was secure. Before my thumb hovered over the power button, I didn't feel a surge of vindictive joy. I didn't feel the need to call her and gloat. The quiet sovereignty I possessed did not require a victory lap. It only required the absolute, undeniable removal of the cancer from my life. I powered down the tablet, the screen fading to black, and looked out over the sprawling, moonlit forest of my estate. The war was over. I stood up, adjusting the silk sash of my robe, and walked back inside my fortress, leaving the tablet on the terrace table. I climbed into my massive, temperature-controlled bed, pulling the heavy, luxurious duvet over my shoulders, and for the first time in 1,460 days, I closed my eyes and fell into a deep, dreamless, uninterrupted sleep. When I woke up, the bedroom was flooded with brilliant golden winter sunlight. It was 7:30 a.m. on Christmas morning. The air in the house was perfectly still, devoid of the suffocating, anxious tension that used to precede every family holiday. I didn't have to dress in uncomfortable, heavily structured clothing to appease my mother's obsession with appearances. I didn't have to brace myself for Jamal's passive-aggressive insults or Lauren's backhanded compliments. I simply slipped on a pair of soft cashmere lounge pants and a loose sweater, padding barefoot down to the kitchen. I turned on a low, soulful jazz playlist that echoed softly through the integrated ceiling speakers, the rich, warm notes of a saxophone filling the massive space. I began preparing breakfast, not a frantic, stressful feast for ungrateful critics, but a simple, beautiful meal for the only person who mattered. The smell of frying bacon, cinnamon, and fresh coffee slowly permeated the house. At 8:00 a.m., right on schedule, I heard the soft, rapid patter of small feet running down the glass staircase. Leo burst into the kitchen wearing his new pajamas, his eyes wide with the pure, unadulterated magic of Christmas morning. "Mommy, Mommy, did he come? Did Santa come?" Harry yelled, launching himself at my legs. I laughed, a bright, genuine sound that felt incredibly good in my chest, and scooped him up into my arms, burying my face in his warm curls. "I don't know, my love. Let's go check." I carried him into the massive living room where the 15-foot professionally decorated Christmas tree stood in the center of the room, surrounded by a mountain of beautifully wrapped gifts. For the next 2 hours, the only sounds in my world were the tearing of wrapping paper, the delighted gasps of my son, and the soft, comforting jazz music. I sat on the floor with him, helping him assemble a complex mechanical dinosaur track, drinking my coffee, entirely present in the moment. I was not a grieving widow, I was not a freeloader, I was a mother, and I was a queen reigning over a peaceful kingdom. But while my world was bathed in golden sunlight and laughter, the digital guillotine I had programmed the night before was dropping with terrifying mechanical efficiency across the city. I knew, without even having to check my tablet, exactly what was happening at 8:00 a.m. in the pristine, heavily manicured, upper-middle-class suburb of Alpharetta. Vivian and Harrison were likely sitting at their breakfast table, their nerves entirely shredded from a sleepless night of panic, desperately waiting for Robert Vance to call them back and confirm their sick, manipulative plan to steal my son. They were probably discussing how to dress for family court, how to present themselves as the tragic, heroic grandparents, saving a child from an unstable mother. They had no idea that I had preempted their move. They had no idea that they were completely out of time. At exactly 8:15 a.m., the quiet, respectful silence of their cul-de-sac was shattered by the arrival of 4 dark, unmarked sedans. The vehicles abruptly blocked their driveway, the doors swinging open simultaneously. A coordinated task force of federal marshals and special agents from the FBI's white-collar crime division stepped out, wearing dark windbreakers with bright yellow lettering across the back. They did not knock politely. They did not care about the neighbors. They pounded heavily on the decorative glass of the front door, the sound echoing through the quiet street. When Harrison, dressed in his silk pajamas, tentatively opened the door, he was immediately met with the blinding flash of federal badges and a stack of arrest warrants signed by a federal judge. I could perfectly imagine the scene. Harrison, the morally superior deacon, stammering and trembling, his legs giving out as the agent swiftly read him his Miranda rights. Vivian rushing to the door in her expensive silk robe, her face contorting in sheer horror as she realized that her darkest secret, the theft of David's blood money, had not only been exposed, but had triggered a full-scale federal raid. She would scream. She would demand they call her non-existent lawyers. She would attempt to use her country club status as a shield against the handcuffs. But the agents wouldn't care. They would march her out onto the frosted front lawn in her slippers, her hands securely fastened behind her back, forcing her to endure the ultimate soul-crushing humiliation, the judging, whispered stares of every single neighbor she had spent the last 2 decades trying to impress. The legacy was dead. The facade was shattered. The matriarch of lies was being loaded into the back of a federal vehicle on Christmas morning. As I helped Leo attach the final piece of his dinosaur track, The encrypted phone resting on the kitchen island began to vibrate, the screen flashing with a secure incoming call. I didn't rush. I smoothly snapped the plastic track together, kissed Leo on the forehead, and walked leisurely over to the island. I picked up the heavy device and glanced at the caller ID. Robert Vance, the ruthless billionaire father of my late husband. The man Vivian had called at 3:30 a.m. in a desperate bid to launch a custody war against me. I let it ring 3 times, allowing the psychological weight of the silence to establish my absolute control over the interaction. Then, I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I did not offer a holiday greeting. I simply waited. "Kendra," Robert's voice rumbled through the speaker. It wasn't the arrogant, aggressive tone of a man preparing to file an emergency custody order. It was the low, dangerous, heavily suppressed voice of a man who had just looked into the abyss. "I assume you are the reason a secure Vanguard Holdings courier arrived at the gates of my estate at 6 o'clock this morning with a locked titanium briefcase." I leaned against the cool marble of the island, watching Leo happily run his mechanical cars around the track. "I am," I replied, my voice completely smooth, devoid of any intimidation. "I trust you found the contents illuminating, Robert." When Vivian had made that desperate phone call the night before, she had gambled on Robert's hatred of me. What she failed to calculate was that my intelligence network was faster, and my evidence was absolute. I hadn't waited for Robert to mobilize his lawyers. I had immediately authorized Marcus to deliver a fully declassified copy of the Vanguard dossier directly to Robert's compound. The briefcase contained the high-resolution scans of the forged power of attorney, the bank routing numbers proving Vivian and Harrison stole his son's life insurance money, the photographic evidence of Jamal hoarding the blackmail material in his safe, and the comprehensive medical reports proving I was in a coma while my own family looted David's legacy. I didn't give Robert a narrative. I gave him indisputable federal-grade proof that the people who had just asked him for help were the exact people who had desecrated his son's memory. "Illuminating" is a profound understatement, Robert breathed, the sheer violent rage vibrating beneath his aristocratic restraint. "Vivian called me hours ago. She tried to tell me you were insane. She tried to offer me Leo in exchange for legal protection." He paused, and I could hear the sound of heavy ice clinking in a crystal glass. "The billionaire was drinking at 9 in the morning. When I opened your dossier, Kendra, when I saw the signature, when I saw that those parasitic country club frauds stole the money David specifically left to protect my grandson, I have never experienced a desire to destroy a bloodline quite like this. My legal team has been on the phone with the federal prosecutor's office for the last hour. I am personally ensuring that the judge denies them bail." "They are currently being processed at the Federal Detention Center," I informed him calmly, sipping my coffee. "Jamal is in the hospital with a shattered face, facing corporate embezzlement charges alongside his wife, who was arrested for felony burglary on my property 4 hours ago. The entire family has been completely neutralized." A long, heavy silence stretched across the encrypted line. For 4 years, Robert had viewed me as a gold digger, a weak, lower-class woman who wasn't worthy of his son's name. But in the span of 12 hours, I had proven that I was a far more ruthless, calculating, and powerful apex predator than he could ever hope to be. I hadn't just protected his grandson, I had annihilated the enemies of his son's estate without even raising my voice. "You didn't need my help," Robert finally said, his tone shifting from rage to a deep, reluctant, almost stunned respect. "You sent me the dossier not to ask for protection, but simply to inform me of the execution." "I am the unbreakable foundation of my own empire, Robert," I said quietly, my eyes fixed on the beautiful, peaceful morning outside my window. "I don't need anyone's help to protect my son, but I thought you deserved to know the truth before I permanently erase them from our lives. Do not attempt to contact me or Leo again unless it is to offer a genuine apology for your behavior over the last 4 years. We are perfectly fine on our own." I didn't wait for his response. I ended the call, the screen going black, completely severing the final thread of the toxic web that had tried to suffocate me. The first 6 weeks of the new year moved with a quiet, methodical grace that I had not experienced since before my husband's death. The bitter Atlanta winter began to thaw, leaving behind crisp, bright mornings, but the absolute freeze I had placed over my bloodline remained completely impenetrable. While my days were spent driving Leo to his new, elite private preschool and overseeing the expansion of Vanguard Holdings from the sunlit sanctuary of my home office, the world outside my gates was actively consuming the wreckage of the people who had tried to bury me. The public humiliation they had so desperately tried to avoid by stealing from me had arrived with a biblical vengeance. The local media had devoured the story. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution had run a front-page exposé detailing the arrest of a prominent local deacon and his socialite wife, exposing the sheer hypocrisy of their country club existence. Harrison had been immediately and unceremoniously stripped of his title at the church, his name physically chiseled off the donor wall in the sanctuary. Vivian's prestigious philanthropic circles had excommunicated her overnight, her former friends suddenly suffering from collective amnesia regarding their relationship with her. They were both sitting in a federal detention center, their requests for bail repeatedly denied, thanks to the lethal combination of my airtight evidence and Robert Vance's limitless legal influence. Jamal, having been discharged from Emory Hospital with a face held together by titanium plates and wire, was not permitted to return to the mansion he once claimed to own. My Vanguard eviction had been executed flawlessly by Marcus and his team. Jamal was currently under federal house arrest, wearing an ankle monitor in a bleak 2-star extended stay motel near the airport, his assets entirely frozen by the IRS. Lauren was faring even worse. Her desperate attempt to flee with the stolen cash had landed her in a high-security county lockup. Her Manhattan divorce attorney had immediately dropped her as a client the moment her funds were seized, leaving her to rely on an overworked public defender who had no patience for her tears or her tantrums. The silence from their end was profound, but the vacuum they left behind quickly attracted the scavengers. It was mid-February when my encrypted personal phone rang, displaying a number I hadn't seen in half a decade. It was Aunt Brenda, Vivian's older sister. For 4 years, Brenda had treated me like a ghost. She had never once called to check on Leo, never sent a birthday card, and never offered a word of comfort after David died. But now, with the matriarch of the family facing decades in a penitentiary, the flying monkeys were being deployed. I accepted the call, placing the phone on speaker as I stood in my kitchen, calmly slicing fresh strawberries for Leo's afternoon snack. "Kendra, praise the Lord I finally got through to you," Brenda began, her voice trembling with a fabricated, breathless panic that sounded exactly like my mother's. "Child, what is happening? This is a nightmare. I've been trying to reach Vivian and they are telling me she is in federal custody. Kendra, you have to fix this. You have to go down to that courthouse and tell those agents there has been a terrible misunderstanding. They are your parents. The Bible says honor thy father and mother. You cannot let your own flesh and blood rot in a jail cell over some silly financial dispute. You need to drop these ridiculous charges right now and bring our family back together." I did not stop slicing the strawberries. The knife made a rhythmic, satisfying thwack against the bamboo cutting board. "There is no misunderstanding, Brenda," I said, my voice as smooth and cold as the marble countertop. "Harrison and Vivian committed federal forgery. They stole $600,000 from my dead husband's life insurance policy while I was fighting for my life in an intensive care unit. They used that blood money to fund Lauren's boutique so Jamal could maintain his illusion of wealth. They are not in jail because of a dispute. They are in jail because they are thieves." Brenda gasped, a sharp, theatrical intake of air. "Even if they made a mistake, Kendra, they are your family. You have all that money now. I heard you sold your little computer business for millions. You don't even need that old insurance money. How can you be so cold, so bitter? Vivian is crying every night in that terrible place. She is your mother. She loves you." I carefully scooped the sliced strawberries into a small porcelain bowl, wiped my hands on a linen towel, and picked up the phone, disabling the speaker so my voice would be the only thing she heard. "Let me ask you a question, Brenda," I said quietly. "Where was this profound dedication to family 4 years ago? Where were you when I was bringing a premature baby home to an empty house? Where were your phone calls when Vivian was sitting in my living room, mocking my grief and calling me a burden? You didn't care about family then. You only care now because the ATM has been shut down." "That is incredibly disrespectful, Kendra," Brenda snapped, her righteous indignation flaring as she realized the guilt trip was failing. "I am your elder. You will not speak to me this way. You are destroying this family out of pure spite, and God will punish you for it. I am going to call the judge myself and tell them you are a vindictive liar who—" "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Brenda," I interrupted, my tone suddenly dropping into a register of absolute terrifying authority. Because while I was conducting the forensic audit of Vivian's personal finances to trace my stolen money, I found a very interesting wire transfer from 3 years ago. A transfer of $45,000 sent directly from Vivian's account to yours. The memo line read mortgage relief. "Did you know that the money she gave you to save your house from foreclosure was the exact same money she stole from my husband's corpse?" The line went dead silent. I could hear the faint, rapid sound of Brenda's shallow breathing. "You accepted stolen funds across state lines, Brenda," I continued relentlessly. "That makes you an accessory after the fact to federal wire fraud. I have the receipts, the routing numbers, and the corresponding dates. If you ever call this number again, if you ever utter my name to another living soul, or if you ever attempt to contact a judge on my mother's behalf, I will email that entire financial packet directly to the lead FBI investigator on this case, and you will be sharing a concrete cell with Vivian before the week is out. Do you understand me?" She didn't say a word. The call abruptly disconnected. I placed the phone back on the counter, feeling nothing but the clean, sterile satisfaction of neutralizing another parasite. I carried the bowl of strawberries out to the terrace, where Leo was happily painting at a small wooden easel. My security chief, Marcus, was standing quietly near the edge of the patio, reviewing a physical mail parcel. He stepped forward as I approached, holding out a thick manila envelope bearing the harsh, stamped seal of the Fulton County Federal Detention Center. "Screened and cleared for physical threats, ma'am," Marcus said, his face impassive. "It's correspondence from Vivian Vance." I took the envelope. I didn't open it immediately. I sat down in my cushioned chair, watching Leo mix blue and yellow paint on his palette, allowing the peacefulness of the moment to anchor me before I engaged with the toxicity of my past. Finally, I slid my finger under the flap and pulled out 3 pages of lined yellow legal paper covered in Vivian's frantic, looping handwriting. It was not an apology. It was a masterclass in narcissistic delusion and emotional gaslighting. "Kendra, my beautiful daughter," the letter began, the very first words dripping with the same manipulative syrup she had used on Christmas Eve. "I am writing this from a cold, terrifying place, surrounded by horrible people. I know you are angry. I know you feel slighted, but you have to understand the immense pressure your father and I were under. Jamal's business was struggling, and his marriage was falling apart. We were just trying to hold the family together. We intended to pay you back every single cent of that insurance money as soon as the logistics company turned a profit. We were protecting your brother, and by extension, we were protecting you from the shame of a family bankruptcy. You are so strong, Kendra. You were always the strong one. You never needed our help like Jamal did. You survived David's passing beautifully, and now you are unimaginably wealthy. You have won. But keeping us in here isn't justice, it's cruelty. Please, for the sake of the family legacy, call the prosecutor. Tell them you authorized the transfer. Tell them it was a loan. You have the power to save our lives. I am begging you, as the woman who gave you life. Do not let me die in this cage." I read the letter twice, my expression never changing. I didn't feel a sudden pang of guilt. I didn't feel the overwhelming urge to rescue her. I felt the absolute validating clarity that I had made the right decision. She hadn't spent a single sentence expressing remorse for robbing her own grandson. She hadn't apologized for forging my signature while I was bleeding on an operating table. Her only regret was that she had been caught, and her only strategy was to demand that I lie to the federal government, risking my own freedom and my son's future simply to save her from the consequences of her own actions. She still believed I was the family's designated shock absorber. She still believed my strength was merely a resource meant to be exploited to cover their weaknesses. I calmly folded the yellow pages back into the envelope. I didn't burn it, and I didn't throw it away. I walked back into my home office, opened the heavy, fireproof filing cabinet beside my desk, and dropped the envelope into a thick red folder labeled Evidence Prosecution Materials. I would hand it directly to the federal prosecutor on Monday to ensure the judge saw exactly what kind of unrepentant manipulator they were dealing with. Just as I closed the cabinet drawer, my encrypted desktop computer chimed with a high-priority video call request. It was Sarah, the lead forensic accountant I had hired to completely dismantle and liquidate the remaining assets of Vanguard Holdings' newest acquisition, Jamal's bankrupt logistics company. I sat down in my leather ergonomic chair and accepted the call. Sarah's face appeared on the high-definition monitor. She looked exhausted, her glasses pushed up into her hair, her desk illuminated by the harsh glow of multiple spreadsheets. "Good afternoon, Kendra," Sarah said, her tone completely devoid of its usual professional warmth. It was flat, serious, and deeply unsettled. "I know it's the weekend, but I needed to bring this to you immediately. The liquidation of the logistics firm is proceeding, but while we were digging through the deepest layers of Jamal's encrypted personal server, the one hidden beneath the payroll architecture, we found something that doesn't fit the embezzlement profile." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk, my instincts instantly sharpening. "Lauren's offshore transfers?" I asked. "No," Sarah shook her head, pulling up a digital document on her shared screen. "Lauren didn't know about this. This was solely Jamal. We found a corporate-owned life insurance policy. They are sometimes called dead peasant policies, usually taken out by a company on key executives to protect the business if they die unexpectedly. But Jamal didn't take this out on himself or his CFO. The document materialized on my screen, bearing the unmistakable watermarks of a massive, shadowy international insurance conglomerate. "Jamal took this policy out 3.5 years ago, Kendra." Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "Exactly 1 month after you were discharged from the hospital following David's death. He insured you." My eyes scanned the digital paperwork, the cold, clinical text blurring for a fraction of a second as the sheer, horrifying reality of the numbers struck me. It was a comprehensive, ironclad life insurance policy taken out on my life. The payout value was $5 million, and the sole irrevocable beneficiary named on the document was Jamal Vance. The air in my office suddenly felt freezing. Jamal hadn't just stolen my husband's money. He hadn't just mocked my grief. He had actively placed a massive secret financial bounty on my head. He had insured my life for $5 million during the exact window of time when I was severely depressed, physically weakened from traumatic surgery, and completely isolated in a dark house. He had looked at his grieving, vulnerable sister and seen nothing but a future payday. He hadn't just been waiting for me to fail. He had been financially betting on my death. And as I stared at his digital signature at the bottom of the document, a chilling, terrifying question echoed through the silence of my fortress. Was he merely betting on my death, or had he been actively planning to ensure it happened? I stared at the digital document glowing on my monitor, the $5 million life insurance policy bearing my name and my brother's forged authorization, and the silence of my home office suddenly transformed from a sanctuary into a vacuum. The air felt thin, sharp, and metallic against the back of my throat. I did not gasp. I did not cry out. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal bypassed my emotional centers entirely and triggered a cold, hyper-focused state of absolute predatory calculation. "Sarah," I said, my voice eerily calm, resonating with a dangerous mechanical precision that made the forensic accountant on the screen visibly flinch. "I want you to immediately isolate that specific server partition, disconnect it from the cloud architecture, mirror the hard drives onto an encrypted physical Vanguard server, and initiate a full-spectrum digital lockdown. No one accesses those files, but me." Sarah nodded rapidly, her hands already flying across her keyboard. "Doing it right now, Kendra." "What? What do you think this means? Do you think he was planning to—" She couldn't bring herself to finish the sentence. "I don't deal in speculation, Sarah. I deal in data," I replied smoothly. "Secure the files and go home. Take the rest of the weekend off. You've done exactly what I pay you to do." I terminated the video call, the screen snapping back to the horrifying document. My mind was rapidly assembling the fragmented timeline of the last 4 years, arranging the pieces of my family's pathology onto a mental chessboard. Jamal was greedy, entitled, and a textbook narcissist, but up until this exact second, I had only categorized him as a financial parasite. This document elevated him to a completely different threat level. He hadn't just insured a healthy 30-year-old woman. He had insured a grieving, isolated widow who was raising his sole nephew. He had insured me for 5 times the amount of David's original policy. A man drowning in corporate debt does not spend thousands of dollars a month on premium life insurance premiums for a sister he despises unless he possesses an absolute, undeniable certainty that the policy will pay out. And Jamal was not a patient man. The implications began to bleed backward through time, staining my darkest memories with a new, terrifying context. 4 years ago, David's death had been classified as a tragic hit and run. It was a rainy Tuesday night in November. David was driving home from his architectural firm. According to the Atlanta Police Department's finalized accident report, a massive commercial freight truck had run a red light at a desolate industrial intersection, T-boning David's sedan on the driver's side with such catastrophic force, the car was pushed into a concrete overpass support. The truck never stopped. Because of the torrential rain, the lack of traffic cameras in that specific grid, and the complete absence of witnesses, the APD Cold Case Division eventually filed it as an unsolved vehicular manslaughter. I had accepted that narrative because the alternative, that a universe could be so cruel as to target my husband intentionally, was too devastating to process while I was fighting for my own life in the ICU. But now, staring at Jamal's signature on a $5 million death bet, the narrative of a random, tragic accident felt violently incomplete. I reached across my desk and pressed the secure intercom button linking directly to the Vanguard Tactical Command Center located on the lower level of my estate. "Marcus," I said, "report to my office immediately. Bring your decryption drives." Less than 60 seconds later, the heavy oak door swung open, and Marcus stepped inside, his posture rigid, sensing the dramatic shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room. I turned my monitor so he could see the life insurance policy. The seasoned security operative's eyes scanned the text, his jaw clenching as the lethal implications registered. "This is a motive for assassination, ma'am," Marcus stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Jamal Vance is currently under federal house arrest for embezzlement, but if he initiated this policy 3 years ago, he's been planning something for a very long time." I leaned back in my leather chair, interlacing my fingers. "I need to know if this was his first attempt to monetize death, Marcus. I need you to bypass the APD archives. I want the complete, unredacted case file for David's collision. Every photograph, every forensic tire mark analysis, every piece of microscopic debris recovered from the scene." Marcus didn't question the legality of the order. He simply plugged his encrypted drive into my terminal. "I have backdoor access to the state database. It will take me exactly 3 minutes." As the progress bar loaded on the screen, I opened a secondary window, directly accessing the seized digital assets of Jamal's logistics company. While you pull the police report, I am going to pull the GPS telematics data for Jamal's entire commercial trucking fleet for the month of November. 4 years ago, I said, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. Lauren embezzled his liquid cash, but she wouldn't have known how to scrub the deep layer routing architecture of his actual freight trucks. If a commercial vehicle hit David, it would have sustained massive front-end damage. The APD couldn't find it because they were looking for a random rogue driver. But what if the truck was hidden in plain sight inside a privately owned commercial fleet? The Vanguard servers roared to life, cross-referencing millions of data points with terrifying speed. Marcus's screen populated first. The grim, sterile photographs of David's crushed sedan filled the monitor, a visceral punch to my chest that I ruthlessly suppressed. The police report noted traces of industrial-grade yellow paint transferred onto David's driver's side door. I turned my attention back to the logistics fleet data. I ran a specific query, filtering for any truck in Jamal's fleet that was active on the night of November 14th in the specific industrial sector where David was killed. The system processed the algorithm. A single result pinged on the screen. Truck number 42, an industrial heavy-duty freight cab. Its GPS transponder showed it had deviated from its assigned interstate route at 10:15 p.m., driving directly through the intersection where David died. At the exact minute, the 911 calls were registered. I felt the blood turn to ice in my veins. "Marcus," I whispered, pointing at the screen. "Cross-reference truck 42 with Jamal's maintenance logs for the week following the crash." Marcus typed rapidly. Truck 42 was reported as totaled in a severe depot accident 2 days after your husband's death. The logs claim it hit a concrete loading dock. The entire front grille and bumper were replaced in-house. The truck was painted black the following month. The pieces of the puzzle locked together with a sickening, metallic snap. It wasn't an accident, it was an execution. Jamal's logistics company was already failing 4 years ago. He was desperate for a massive influx of cash. He knew David had a $1 million policy meant for me and Leo. Jamal calculated that if David died, the grieving, pregnant widow would naturally turn to her parents for financial management. Jamal planned to simply ask Vivian and Harrison for a loan from the insurance money once they controlled it. So he ordered one of his drivers to intercept David's route. But Jamal's sociopathic master plan had a fatal flaw: his own mother's greed. When Vivian and Harrison stole the $600,000, they didn't give it to Jamal's logistics company. They gave it to Lauren to save her boutique, prioritizing the appearance of their daughter-in-law's success over their son's failing business. Jamal had orchestrated a murder for $1 million payout, only to be completely cut out of the spoils by his own parents. That was the origin of his blinding rage. That was why he had gathered the forged documents and blackmailed his parents. He was furious they had stolen his blood money. And when that blackmail money began to dry up, he had quietly taken out the $5 million policy on me, waiting for the perfect moment to orchestrate a second accident, to finally secure the wealth he felt he was owed. He wasn't just a toxic brother. He was a serial predator who had slaughtered the father of my child. "I need the name of the driver assigned to Truck 42 on that night," I commanded, the cold sovereignty of my voice replaced by the absolute, unyielding authority of an apex predator closing in on its prey. Marcus pulled the employment records. A man named Elias Thorne. He resigned from the company 3 days after the crash. I immediately ran Elias Thorne through the global financial tracking software Vanguard used for international threat assessment. Within seconds, a wire transfer illuminated the screen. 3 days after David's death, a sum of $50,000 was wired from a shell account linked directly to Jamal's personal social security number into a Cayman Islands account registered to Elias Thorne. Payment for services rendered, the physical proof of a murder-for-hire conspiracy. The silence in the office was deafening. I slowly stood up from my chair, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from my dark linen slacks. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. The grief for David had been processed years ago. What remained was only a pristine, crystallized wrath. Jamal thought he was untouchable. He thought his secrets were buried inside the crushed metal of a totaled truck and the encrypted layers of a private server. He didn't realize he had built his house of lies on a digital fault line, and I controlled the tectonic plates. "Print everything," I said to Marcus, my eyes locked on the undeniable evidence of my brother's monstrosity. The GPS logs, the maintenance reports, the wire transfer, and the life insurance policy. Put them in a single unmarked folder. Marcus complied, the heavy laser printer humming in the corner. "Ma'am, we have enough evidence to hand this directly over to the FBI Homicide Division right now. They will pull him out of that motel in chains." I shook my head slowly, retrieving my heavy wool coat from the back of the door. "The FBI will have their turn, Marcus, but they are a bureaucracy. They operate on procedure. Jamal has spent his entire life believing he is the smartest, most powerful man in the room, hiding behind our parents' protection. Before he goes to a concrete cell for the rest of his natural life, I am going to look him in the eyes and make sure he understands exactly who destroyed him. Prepare the SUV. We are going for a drive." The journey from the pristine, heavily guarded gates of my Buckhead estate to the crumbling, neon-lit squalor of the airport motel took exactly 42 minutes. The contrast between the two worlds was a poetic reflection of our internal realities. I sat in the back of the armored vehicle, watching the gray, freezing drizzle wash over the city streets, the manila folder resting heavily on my lap. I felt no fear. I felt no hesitation. I was the architect of my own closure. The SUV pulled into the pothole-ridden parking lot of the Starlight Inn. It was a miserable, decaying structure, smelling of stale tobacco, damp carpet, and absolute failure. Marcus stepped out first, his hand resting near his concealed sidearm, scanning the perimeter. We walked up the rusted metal stairs to the second floor, the cheap fluorescent bulbs buzzing angrily overhead. Room 214, the last known address of the Golden Child. Marcus did not knock. He didn't need to. He simply bypassed the cheap electronic keycard reader with a master decryption fob, the door clicking open with a pathetic squeak. I pushed the door open and stepped into the gloom. The room was suffocatingly small, dominated by a stained mattress and a flickering, static-filled television mounted to the wall. The air was thick with the smell of cheap takeout and unwashed laundry. Sitting on the edge of the bed, illuminated by the harsh blue light of a rerun sitcom, was Jamal. The transformation was startling. The arrogant, broad-shouldered CEO who had screamed at me across a mahogany dining table on Christmas Eve was completely gone. He was wearing wrinkled sweatpants and a stained T-shirt, his ankles securely strapped with a bulky, blinking federal monitoring monitor. His face was a grotesque canvas of dark purple and yellow bruising, his nose flattened and braced by surgical tape, his jaw wired tightly shut to facilitate the healing of the fractures Marcus had inflicted. He looked up as I entered, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated terror. He tried to scramble backward against the headboard, a muffled, pathetic sound of panic escaping through his clenched teeth. He thought Marcus was here to finish the physical assault. I raised my hand slightly, signaling Marcus to remain by the door, blocking the only exit. I walked slowly to the center of the room, standing beneath the buzzing ceiling light, looking down at the broken, miserable creature that used to be my brother. "I am not here to hurt you physically, Jamal," I said quietly, the absolute calm of my voice echoing strangely in the cheap motel room. "Your physical suffering is irrelevant to me. I am here to correct a narrative." Jamal stared at me, his chest heaving, sweat beading on his bruised forehead. He couldn't speak, which forced him to do the one thing he had never done in his entire life: listen. I lifted the manila folder and dropped it onto the cheap, laminate surface of the small table next to the television. The heavy thud made him flinch. "For 4 years, you let this family call me a freeloader," I began, my tone conversational, yet laced with an undeniable lethal gravity. You watched Vivian and Harrison mock my grief. You watched Lauren humiliate me. You allowed them to believe that I was weak, that David's death had broken my spirit, and that I was simply a burden waiting to be carried. And you reveled in that narrative because it elevated you. But we both know that was a lie, Jamal. We both know the truth about what happened on November 14th. At the mention of the date, the remaining color drained entirely from Jamal's face. The terror in his eyes shifted from physical fear to a profound existential dread. He knew exactly what I was talking about. I calmly reached out and opened the folder, pulling out the printed documents one by one, laying them out like tarot cards, predicting his doom. Card number 1, I said, dropping the GPS telematics report for truck 42. Your freight truck, off route, running the red light at the exact intersection where my husband's car was crushed. Jamal let out a strangled, high-pitched whine, shaking his head frantically, his wired jaw preventing him from forming the lies he so desperately wanted to tell. Card number 2, I continued, dropping the maintenance log. The immediate in-house repair of the massive front-end damage to that specific truck, completely bypassing insurance adjusters to keep it off the federal radar. I picked up the financial printout. Card number 3, a $50,000 wire transfer from your personal account to Elias Thorne, 3 days after you made me a widow. Jamal completely collapsed into himself, curling into a tight, trembling ball on the stained mattress, a steady stream of tears leaking from his terrified eyes, mixing with the sweat on his bruised cheeks. The absolute, unassailable proof of his sociopathy was staring him in the face, stripping away every single layer of his ego, his entitlement, and his humanity. But I wasn't finished. I pulled the final document from the folder, the $5 million life insurance policy. And the final card, I whispered, stepping closer to the bed, holding the document so the harsh light illuminated his forged signature. The dead peasant policy. The moment you realized Vivian had stolen your blood money to fund Lauren's boutique, you didn't give up. You just changed targets. You insured my life for $5 million. You spent the last 3 years watching me, waiting for me to be weak enough, isolated enough, for you to arrange another tragic accident so you could finally save your pathetic company. You looked at your sister and your nephew, and you saw nothing but an ATM. The room was suffocatingly silent, save for the muffled, ragged sobs of the broken man on the bed. He had no defense. He had no leverage. He was completely, utterly exposed. I didn't feel the urge to scream at him. I didn't feel the urge to strike him. I simply looked at him with the cold, sterile detachment of a scientist observing a failed, toxic experiment. You underestimated me, Jamal, I said softly, sliding the documents back into the folder. You thought my silence was submission. You thought my grace was weakness. You thought that because I didn't scream and cry and demand attention, I was blind to the monsters in my house. But I wasn't blind. I was simply building the cage. I turned my back on him and walked toward the door. I paused, looking over my shoulder one last time. The federal marshals are already on their way, I informed him, my hand resting on the rusted doorknob. I sent the unredacted files to the homicide division 10 minutes before I arrived. Your embezzlement charges are going to be upgraded to conspiracy to commit murder for hire, insurance fraud, and federal racketeering. You will never take another breath as a free man. You will die in a concrete box, completely forgotten by the world, while I raise my son in the empire I built. This is the end of your bloodline, Jamal, and it is the beginning of mine. I stepped out of the miserable room, the cheap door clicking shut behind me, completely sealing Jamal Vance inside his own personal hell. The freezing rain hit my face as I walked down the rusted metal stairs toward the waiting SUV, but I didn't shiver. For the first time in my life, I felt completely, overwhelmingly warm. It took exactly 14 months for the slow, grinding, mechanical wheels of the federal and state justice systems to completely pulverize what was left of the Vance bloodline, reducing their manufactured legacy to a series of digitized court transcripts and inmate identification numbers. The trials were swift, brutal and highly publicized, transforming the quiet, respected country club family into a cautionary tale plastered across the front pages of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and debated endlessly on local news stations. I did not attend a single day of the proceedings. I did not sit in the uncomfortable wooden pews of the gallery to perform the expected societal role of the tearful, traumatized victim seeking closure. I had already secured my closure the night I walked out of that cheap airport motel. Instead, I remained in the pristine, sunlit sanctuary of my Buckhead estate, expanding Vanguard Holdings' portfolio while Marcus and my elite legal team provided me with daily encrypted briefings on the absolute destruction of my abusers. Vivian and Harrison were the first to fall, because I had systematically paid massive retainer fees to conflict out the top 20 white-collar defense firms in the state of Georgia. My parents were forced to rely on overworked, underfunded court-appointed attorneys who had neither the time nor the inclination to humor Vivian's delusions of grandeur. According to the transcripts, Vivian attempted to treat the federal courtroom like a charity gala, addressing the judge with the same syrupy, manipulative condescension she had used on me for decades. She tried to frame the theft of David's $600,000 life insurance payout as a simple family misunderstanding, a temporary loan necessary to protect her son's business. The federal prosecutor, armed with a pristine Vanguard dossier, mercilessly dismantled her facade. He projected the forged power of attorney documents onto the courtroom monitors, highlighting the corrupt notary seal and tracing the exact wire transfers that proved the money bypassed Jamal's logistics company entirely and went straight into Lauren's failing boutique. When the prosecution called the corrupt church clerk to the stand, a woman who had eagerly taken a plea deal to save herself, Harrison's image as a morally superior deacon evaporated completely. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who openly expressed her disgust at the exploitation of a grieving widow, handed down sentences that sent a shockwave through their remaining social circles. Harrison received 7 years in a medium-security federal correctional institution. Vivian received 8 years. Marcus reported that when the bailiffs approached to place Vivian in handcuffs, she physically collapsed onto the defense table, screaming for her country club friends in the gallery to help her, only to find the gallery entirely empty of the people she had sacrificed my sanity to impress. Lauren's trial was an exercise in pathetic desperation. She attempted to play the ultimate victim, sobbing hysterically on the stand, claiming that Jamal had terrorized her and that she was completely unaware the funds she had embezzled from his company were tied to my husband's blood money. Her defense shattered the moment the prosecution played the high-definition, infrared footage of her violently smashing through the basement wall with a crowbar to steal the blackmail documents and the hidden cash. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before convicting her of felony burglary, corporate embezzlement, and grand larceny. She was sentenced to 5 years in a state penitentiary, her screaming protests echoing down the courtroom hallway as she was dragged away, her designer clothes replaced by a harsh canvas uniform. But the true, horrifying spectacle was the murder-for-hire trial of Jamal Vance. The FBI Homicide Division had moved with terrifying efficiency. Utilizing the telematics data and the offshore wire transfers I had provided to track down Elias Thorne, the driver of Truck 42. Facing the lethal injection table for capital murder, Thorne immediately flipped on Jamal, signing a comprehensive confession that detailed exactly how Jamal had hired him to execute David at that specific industrial intersection. During the trial, the prosecution painted a chilling, undeniable portrait of a narcissistic sociopath who viewed human life as a disposable commodity. They presented the $5 million dead peasant life insurance policy Jamal had secretly taken out on my life, proving to the jury that his hunger for unearned wealth was an active, ongoing threat. Jamal sat at the defense table, his wired jaw finally healed, but his spirit completely broken. He tried to maintain his arrogant posture, but as the evidence piled up like dirt on a coffin, his shoulders slumped and his eyes grew hollow. When the jury foreperson read the verdict, guilty on all counts, including conspiracy to commit capital murder and federal racketeering, Jamal turned around, his eyes frantically scanning the gallery behind him. He was searching for his mother to defend him, his father to pray for him, his sister to bail him out. But there was no one. The benches were completely empty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, condemned to spend the rest of his natural existence in a 6x8 concrete cell in a maximum security federal penitentiary. As the cell doors slammed shut on my former family, the silence they left behind was not an empty void, but a massive, echoing expanse of absolute freedom. However, the entitlement of a parasite does not simply vanish when the host walks away. It merely changes its tactics. 6 months into their respective sentences, the letters began to arrive at the Vanguard corporate headquarters. They were forwarded to my estate by my security team, bundled in thick manila envelopes. They were written on cheap, lined prison paper filled with frantic, looping handwriting. Vivian wrote constantly, her letters alternating between manipulative guilt trips and pathetic begging. She wrote about the terrible food, the lack of respect from the guards, the sheer terror of being locked in a room with violent offenders. She begged me to put money on her commissary account. She begged me to hire an appellate lawyer to fight her conviction. She wrote, "Kendra, the Bible says we must forgive. I am your mother. You cannot abandon me in this dark place. We are family." Harrison's letters were filled with desperate, quoting scriptures, claiming he had found true salvation behind bars and that God was commanding me to orchestrate his release. Lauren wrote letters blaming Vivian and Harrison for corrupting Jamal, begging me to set up a trust fund for her when she got out so she wouldn't be destitute. Even Jamal, facing an eternity behind bars, managed to have a public defender send a formal request for me to visit him, claiming he wanted to make peace with his sins. I did not read beyond the first few lines of the initial batch. I did not write back. I did not engage. I did not change my address or block the incoming mail because I wanted them to know with absolute certainty that I was receiving their desperate pleas and actively, consciously choosing to ignore them. I took every single piece of prison correspondence, walked over to the heavy-duty industrial shredder in my home office, and fed the pages into the steel blades, watching their words turn into meaningless confetti. Society, and particularly the cultural expectations placed upon Black women, dictates that we are supposed to be the endless well of forgiveness. We are expected to be the strong Black woman who endures unimaginable abuse, only to turn around and visit our abusers in prison, put money on their books, pray for their souls, and carry the heavy mantle of the family's spiritual salvation. We are expected to heal the people who broke us. I actively, fiercely rejected that trope. I refused to be the mule of the world. I refused to let my grace be misinterpreted as a weakness they could continue to exploit from behind steel bars. My forgiveness was not a requirement for their redemption, and my presence was not a resource they were entitled to consume. I owed them absolutely nothing. My only allegiance, my only duty was to the beautiful, innocent boy sleeping down the hall and to the quiet, peaceful empire I had built to protect him. Once the legal proceedings were completely finalized and the appellate deadlines had expired, I realized that my massive glass fortress in Buckhead had served its purpose. It had been the perfect command center for a war, but I no longer needed to be a wartime general. The sprawling mansions of Atlanta, the heavy, humid air, the streets where David had been killed, and the geography that contained the ghosts of my family's betrayal felt suddenly suffocating. I didn't want to live in a monument to my survival. I wanted to live in a testament to my freedom. I quietly placed the Buckhead estate on the private market, where it sold for a massive profit in less than a week to an international tech executive. I transferred the primary operational headquarters of Vanguard Holdings to a team of elite, hand-picked executives, transitioning my own role to a purely visionary board position that required only a few hours of encrypted virtual meetings a week. I packed up my son, my trusted security chief, Marcus, and a small, dedicated staff, and we left Georgia entirely. We flew across the country, leaving the ghosts behind, and landed on the breathtaking, rugged coastline of Monterey, California. I had purchased a sprawling, historic 20-acre estate, perched high on a dramatic cliff overlooking the infinite, crashing waves of the Pacific Ocean. The architecture was entirely different from the sterile, modern fortress in Atlanta. It was a beautiful, sprawling Spanish colonial revival home, featuring warm terracotta tiles, massive arched windows, exposed cedar beams, and expansive, sun-drenched courtyards filled with blooming bougainvillea, ancient olive trees, and the constant soothing sound of cascading stone fountains. It was not a house built for defense. It was a sanctuary built for breathing. The air here was always crisp, carrying the clean, briny scent of the ocean and the earthy aroma of the surrounding cypress forests. There were no country clubs to impress. There were no societal expectations to navigate. There was only the horizon. The transition was seamless, a beautiful exhalation of breath I had been holding for 4 agonizing years. I enrolled Leo in a prestigious, progressive private school nestled in the coastal hills, where he spent his days learning about marine biology, painting, and running free, completely untethered from the heavy, toxic legacy of the Vance name. I established a massive philanthropic arm of Vanguard Holdings, quietly funneling millions of dollars into fully funded scholarships for minority women in STEM, domestic violence survivor programs, and legal defense funds for victims of corporate abuse. I did not put my name on the buildings. I did not seek out magazine covers or awards. I operated entirely in the shadows, using the massive capital I had extracted from the darkest period of my life to silently illuminate the paths of others who were currently fighting their own quiet wars. I had taken the blood money of my family's greed and transformed it into an engine of absolute grace. A year after the relocation to the Pacific Coast, the memory of the chaotic, screaming dining room on Christmas Eve felt like a scene from a movie I had watched a lifetime ago. It was a Tuesday morning, the air crisp and bright. I woke up at dawn, not with a jolt of anxiety or the dread of an incoming crisis, but with the gentle, natural rhythm of the ocean outside my window. I slipped into a soft, oversized cashmere sweater and comfortable linen trousers, walking barefoot across the smooth, sun-warmed saltillo tiles of the hallway. The house was completely silent, save for the rhythmic, distant roar of the waves crashing against the jagged cliffs far below. I walked into the massive, open-concept kitchen, the morning light pouring through the arched windows and reflecting off the hand-painted Spanish tiles. I filled my copper kettle, the familiar rush of water grounding me in the present moment, and prepared a cup of rich, dark roast coffee. I didn't need to check my encrypted tablet for security breaches. I didn't need to brace myself for a phone call. I carried my steaming mug out through the heavy wooden doors and onto the expansive stone terrace that hung precariously over the edge of the world. The Pacific Ocean stretched out before me in a massive, uninterrupted expanse of deep, shimmering sapphire, meeting the pale blue sky at a horizon line that looked infinitely peaceful. The cool ocean breeze swept across my face, tossing my hair gently around my shoulders. I leaned against the heavy stone balustrade, wrapping my hands around the warmth of the ceramic mug, and took a long, slow breath, pulling the clean, salty air deep into my lungs. Down in the courtyard, I could hear the soft, joyful sound of Leo laughing as he chased one of the rescue dogs we had adopted across the manicured grass. He was 6 years old now, tall and strong, his eyes bright and completely unshadowed by trauma. He didn't know the address of a federal penitentiary. He didn't know what a foreclosure notice looked like. He only knew the safety of his mother's arms and the boundless possibilities of the world I had secured for him. I had broken the generational curse with the swift, merciless swing of a digital sword, ensuring that the toxicity of the Vance bloodline stopped permanently with me. I closed my eyes, letting the morning sun warm my skin and reflected on the journey. My family had looked at me and seen a beast of burden. They had seen a woman whose intellect, grief, and capital were merely raw materials designed to be harvested for their own comfort. They had demanded that I be the unbreakable foundation of their fragile, lying empire. They had mistaken my quiet endurance for stupidity, my polite detachment for submission, and my silence for surrender. They had believed the cultural lie that because I was a strong black woman, I was inherently capable of absorbing an infinite amount of their abuse without ever breaking, without ever demanding recompense, and without ever leaving. But they had tragically misunderstood the true nature of a matriarch. A true matriarch does not exist to be a martyr. She exists to be a sovereign. Her grace is not a blanket that covers the sins of the wicked. It is the impenetrable armor she wears while she systematically burns their kingdom to the ground and builds a better one upon the ashes. I took a sip of my coffee, the rich, bitter flavor blooming on my tongue, and opened my eyes to look out over the vast, beautiful ocean that now belonged to me. I had spent my entire life fighting in the dark so they could live in the light. But the moment I finally realized my worth and walked away, I took the sun with me.